Walking doesn't burn visceral fat when you start. It burns it when your biology is ready. Many people begin walking with a very simple assumption. The more you walk, the more fat you burn, and if after a few weeks the waistline does not change significantly, they conclude that walking is not intense enough. This is where linear thinking deceives you. The body does not burn fat simply because you start moving. It burns fat when the internal biological environment reaches the appropriate conditions. Visceral fat is not a passive layer sitting quietly under the skin. It functions as an endocrine tissue. It secretes cytokines, affects insulin sensitivity, and constantly communicates with the liver and the immune system. It participates in your hormonal network. That means burning this type of fat is not simply about burning calories. It depends on signals. When you take the first steps of a walk, the body does not immediately switch into deep fat burning mode. It prioritizes glucose, the most accessible fuel. The phosphagen system provides immediate energy in the first few seconds. Then, glycolysis takes over, drawing glucose from the blood and glycogen from the muscles. At this stage, you are expending energy, but you are not necessarily accessing visceral fat. And this is the point where many people give up. They walk for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They do not feel a burn. They do not feel exhausted. Nothing dramatic happens. They think, maybe I need to walk faster. So they increase the pace, push the heart rate too high, and unintentionally shift back to glucose dependence. What they do not realize is that there is a metabolic crossover, a moment where the body begins to prioritize fatty acids as its primary fuel. This moment is not loud. There is no bell, no explosive sensation, but at the cellular level, everything changes. Mitochondria increase activity. The respiratory exchange ratio decreases. Beta oxidation rises. And when hormonal conditions are stable enough, especially when cortisol does not spike suddenly, visceral fat becomes more accessible. The issue is not how many total minutes you walk. The issue is how many minutes you spend in the correct biological state. I want you to ask a different question. Instead of, have I walked enough? Ask, is my body ready to burn visceral fat? Because walking is not a test of willpower. It is a process of system regulation, heart rate, respiration, hormones, the autonomic nervous system. When those factors synchronize, walking transforms from a gentle activity into a powerful metabolic tool. Part 1. The real moment when the body shifts from glucose to fat. If you remember only one idea from this section, remember, this walking begins to burn deep fat when your oxygen system stabilizes, not when you take your first step. The body always follows sequence, never randomness. In the first minutes, it prioritizes easy access energy glucose and glycogen. The reason is simple. Glucose produces ATP quickly. When you begin moving, energy demand rises abruptly, and the body chooses the fastest available source. But walking is not a sprint. It is repetitive motion. And repetitive motion creates a biological question. Is this demand going to continue? As you keep walking and your breathing begins to stabilize, the body upgrades its energy production system. This is when mitochondria truly step onto the stage. And when mitochondria engage strongly enough, something happens. Beta oxidation increases the body, begins using fatty acids as its primary fuel. This is the moment you are looking for. It is not a fixed minute for everyone. It depends on 3 variables. 1, your level of metabolic adaptation. If you have been sedentary for a long time and mitochondrial density is low, the body will cling to glucose longer. If you walk consistently, the shift toward fat will occur earlier in each session. 2, your hormonal environment right before the walk. If you have just eaten a high-sugar meal or eaten too close to your walk, insulin remains elevated, and the body will prioritize glucose longer. If you walk in a lower insulin state, the shift toward fat will occur sooner. 3. Your baseline stress level. If baseline cortisol is high, the body tends to hold on to glucose as a safe exit because it is easier to regulate. When stress is low and the nervous system is stable, the body transitions to fat more easily. And now, the most important part, the most reliable external sign that you are approaching that moment is heart rate. You do not need devices. You only need to understand the logic. When heart rate is too low, the oxygen system is not activated strongly enough, and the shift toward fat occurs slowly. When heart rate is too high, the body returns to prioritizing glucose because higher intensity demands rapid energy. Walking is most powerful in the moderate intensity zone, the zone where you breathe deeper but remain in control, still able to speak in short sentences. This zone creates the perfect condition, enough demand to activate mitochondria, but not enough strain to trigger a cortisol spike. This is why walking is often more effective for visceral fat than many people realize. It places the body into a metabolic safety zone where the nervous system does not interpret the activity as a threat, and hormones are not pulled into defensive mode. In other words, you do not need to push the body into battle to burn visceral fat. You need to guide it into a state ready to release it. Part 2. Why visceral fat unlocks in a stable state, not in a fight state. Now we touch the point that many people have misunderstood for years. Visceral fat is not stubborn because it is malicious. It is stubborn because it is protected by survival biology. Visceral fat sits deep around the organs. It is close to the liver, close to the portal vein system, close to the immune system. It is not just an energy store. It is a signaling hub, and because it is directly tied to survival, the body only allows it to be mobilized strongly when internal conditions are appropriate. What are those conditions? 1. The nervous system must be in a regulated state. When you are stressed, the sympathetic system switches on. Heart rate rises. Breathing becomes shallow. The brain receives the signal danger. And when the brain senses danger, cortisol rise. Cortisol is not the enemy. It is a survival hormone. It does one very clear thing. It keeps easily accessible fuel in the bloodstream so you can respond quickly. That means it pushes the body to prioritize glucose and limits heavy reliance on fat when speed is required. That is why if you jump into an excessively intense workout before your body is adapted, you may burn a lot of energy but fail to create the optimal environment for consistent visceral fat mobilization. You may feel exhausted. You may sweat, but biologically, you are in fight mode, not restructuring mode. Moderate intensity walking does the opposite. It increases energy demand without triggering alarm. It keeps you in a zone where the nervous system feels, I am active. But there is no threat. And when there is no threat, cortisol does not need to spike. When cortisol does not spike, the body does not need to hold on to glucose as the mandatory option. That is when beta oxidation has room to operate and visceral fat begins to open. 2. Insulin sensitivity must improve over time. Visceral fat is strongly linked to insulin resistance. When insulin is constantly high or insulin sensitivity is poor, the body tends to store energy in the deep abdominal region and releases it very slowly. Consistent walking does something extremely important. It improves insulin sensitivity without creating major stress. It is as if you are retraining cells to handle glucose properly. So insulin does not need to be secreted excessively. To put it directly, you cannot burn visceral fat if every day you are unintentionally creating a prolonged high insulin environment. And here's the point: many overlook visceral fat may have a higher turnover rate than you think, but only when the body is placed in the correct state. It is not that it does not change. It simply does not change in the wrong signaling environment. 3. You need sufficient time in the steady state window. If you walk briefly and then stop, just as the oxygen system has stabilized, just as heart rate has settled, just as mitochondrial activity has increased, you end the session. This is why a longer walking session is not just longer in total minutes. It is longer in the right state. The second half of a walk is often the phase when the body has stabilized, shifted to fat, and entered the steady state metabolic window. That is where visceral fat begins to contribute more significantly. So if you are thinking, I will just walk really fast and get it over with, you are turning walking into a rhythm-disrupting activity. You make it harder. You increase stress. You may push the body back toward glucose reliance, and you lose the most important factor, biological stability. Part 3. Why walking every day makes the fat-burning moment arrive sooner. There is something very few people realize. The body learns. It does not just react to individual sessions. It adapts to repeated rhythm. When you walk consistently every day, the first thing that changes is not your waistline. It is your mitochondria, the energy factories inside your cells. With moderate, repeated stimulation, the body increases both the number and efficiency of mitochondria. This means your capacity to use fatty acids as fuel improves. And when the fat oxidation system becomes stronger, the metabolic crossover, the moment you shift from glucose to fat, happens earlier in each walk. In other words, on the first day, you may need 15 to 20 minutes before your body truly enters the deep fat-burning zone. After a few weeks, it may take only 8 to 10 minutes, not because you are pushing harder, but because the system has been primed, prepared in advance. At the same time, consistent walking recalibrates the two hormones that most influence visceral fat, insulin and cortisol. With steady walking, insulin sensitivity gradually improves. Muscle cells absorb glucose more efficiently. This reduces the pressure to store energy around the internal organs. Baseline insulin decreases slightly but sustainably, and that is what allows deep abdominal fat to become progressively easier to mobilize. On the cortisol side, repetition creates predictability for the nervous system. When an activity becomes a familiar habit, the brain no longer interprets it as stress. Heart rate stabilizes more quickly, breathing settles sooner. The sympathetic system is not excessively activated. The result is that each new walking session does not begin from zero. It begins from a body that has already been adjusted. This is the power of rhythm. If you walk irregularly, one day very long, the next day skipped, another day too fast, the body does not receive a stable enough pattern to optimize its fat oxidation system. Each restart sends you back to biological square one. But when you maintain steady rhythm, moderate intensity, sufficient duration, consistent frequency, you are teaching the body. This is the new environment, and the body will adjust enzyme structure, increase capillary density, and improve fatty acid transport into the mitochondria. At that point, visceral fat is no longer stubborn fat. It becomes part of the energy cycle. The most important thing I want you to understand is this: walking does not change you in a single session. It changes how your body handles energy between sessions. And when you reach the state where heart rate stabilizes quickly, breathing settles early, and the shift to fat happens almost automatically. That is when walking is no longer just an activity. It becomes a new metabolic system. Part 4. The steady state window when body and habit synchronize. At this point, you are no longer asking, how long should I walk? The right question is, how long have I been inside the steady state metabolic window? Steady state is not about walking slowly. It is the state where heart rate, breathing, and energy demand are balanced. Oxygen supply is sufficient. Cortisol does not spike. Mitochondria operate steadily, and beta oxidation is maintained continuously. This is the zone where visceral fat begins contributing more significantly to energy. Not because it is forced, but because biological conditions are appropriate. You can recognize steady state through very specific signals. Breathing becomes deeper but not rushed. You can speak short sentences without gasping. Your body gradually feels warmer, not sharply overheated. Your stride and breath begin to synchronize naturally. When you reach this state, the body no longer resists movement. It participates in it. Glucose is no longer the mandatory choice. Fat oxidation becomes sustainable. ATP is produced more slowly, but more steadily. What matters is this: not every minute of a walk is equal. The first minutes are biochemical warm-up. The middle and final phases are where deep metabolic value emerges. That is why 40 minutes differs from 20, not because calories are doubled, but because your time inside the steady state window is longer. And when you repeat this daily, the body begins to predict. Heart rate stabilizes faster. Breathing falls into rhythm earlier. The shift to fat happens almost automatically. You do not need to wait as long to unlock it. This is the point many miss. Visceral fat does not decrease through explosive bursts. It decreases through synchronization between hormones, the nervous system, and movement rhythm. When biology aligns with habit, you no longer have to try to burn fat. The body prioritizes fat as fuel because it is the most efficient choice in a stable environment. And that is the entire difference. Walking is not light exercise. It is a system regulation tool if you understand how to place the body in the right state. If you look back over this journey, you will see you do not need to walk faster. You do not need to be more exhausted. You do not need to push the body into extremes. You need rhythm. You need stability. You need to create an environment that biology trusts. Health Explained does not sell motivation. We do not say, push harder. We simply help you stop fighting your system and start working with it. If you want to understand your body as biological architecture rather than a calorie-counting machine, follow the channel. Here, we do not burn fat with willpower. We change through design.